Look at your hands right now. Those hands are connected to a government. And that government, whatever country you live in, has secrets, filing cabinets full of them, warehouses full of them, secrets that were classified for 50, 70, sometimes 80 years, secrets that are only now seeing daylight. World War II ended nearly 80 years ago, but the full story is still being written, because every few years another batch of documents gets declassified, another archive opens, another government admits what it denied for decades, and the picture that emerges is darker than anything they taught you in school. Tonight, we are going through 100 facts about the Second World War that come directly from official records. Declassified files, court transcripts, military archives, government admissions. These are not conspiracy theories. These are documented realities that were simply too disturbing to tell the public at the time. If you are using this to fall asleep, perfect. These revelations have waited decades to be told. They can wait a few more hours while you drift off. Subscribe and stick around. We have a long night ahead of us, and the official record has some uncomfortable things to say. Let us start with the experiments, because nothing reveals the darkness of war quite like what governments did to human beings in the name of science. And not just enemy governments, all of them. The records are clear, the documentation exists. The survivors, when there were any, eventually told their stories. Unit 731. That designation appears in thousands of declassified documents. A Japanese biological warfare research unit operating in Manchuria, from 1937 to 1945. The official death toll from their experiments is somewhere between 3,000 and 12,000 people. The actual number may never be known. According to documents released by the National Archives in 2007, prisoners were infected with plague, cholera, and anthrax, then dissected while still alive without anesthesia to observe the progression of disease through living tissue. The researchers called their subjects logs because officially they were processing lumber, not people. Here is fact number 1 that rarely makes the history books. After the war, the United States granted immunity to Unit 731 researchers in exchange for their data. General Douglas MacArthur personally approved the deal. The documents confirming this were classified until 1998. Dr. Shiro Ishii, the unit commander, never faced trial. He lived in Japan until 1959, consulted for American biological weapons programs, and died of throat cancer at age 67. His victims got no such peaceful end. The American government knew everything. They decided the data was worth more than Fort Detrick in Maryland became America's biological weapons center after the war. Declassified documents reveal that much of the early research there was based directly on Unit 731 data. Scientists from the unit were brought to the United States as consultants. The arrangement was kept secret for over 50 years, but Japan was not alone in conducting human experiments. The Nuremberg trials documented Nazi medical experiments in horrifying detail. Yet even those transcripts were partially classified for decades. The full scope of what happened at camps, like Dachau and Ravensbrück fake, was considered too disturbing for public release. Dr. Sigmund Rasche conducted high-altitude experiments for the Luftwaffe. Prisoners were placed in pressure chambers, and the air slowly removed to simulate conditions at 40,000 feet. According to trial documents, 200 people died in these experiments. Russia meticulously recorded their final moments as they suffocated. The freezing experiments are perhaps the most infamous. Prisoners were submerged in ice water for up to 3 hours while researchers recorded their body temperatures as they died of hypothermia. The stated goal was finding ways to revive Luftwaffe pilots who crashed into the North Sea. 300 people died providing that data. Here is what the declassified files reveal that the textbooks often omit. American and British researchers used the Nazi hypothermia data. A 1945 report from the Army Air Force's Aeromedical Laboratory explicitly cites the Dachau experiments. The ethics of using data obtained through torture were debated. The data was used anyway. The chemical experiments extended beyond concentration camps. Declassified British documents from 2004 revealed that between 1939 and 1989, over 20,000 British servicemen were exposed to chemical agents in tests at Porton Down. They were told they were testing cures for the common cold. Leading aircraftman Ronald Madison died at Porton Down in 1953 after liquid sarin was dripped onto his arm. He was 20 years old. The inquest into his death was kept secret for 50 years. When it finally became public in 2004, the coroner ruled it unlawful killing. No one was ever prosecuted. The malaria experiments at Stateville Penitentiary infected over 400 prisoners with malaria between 1944 and 1946. The research was conducted to find treatments for troops fighting in the Pacific. Prisoners were promised reduced sentences. Most never received them. The experiments were praised at Nuremberg as an example of ethical research with consent. The United States conducted similar experiments on its own military project SHAD, which stands for Shipboard Hazard and Defense, ran from 1962 to 1973, but used protocols developed during World War II. Sailors were deliberately exposed to biological and chemical agents. The program was only acknowledged in 2,050 years after it began. The Tuskegee experiments were already running during World War 2400. Black men with syphilis were deliberately left untreated, so researchers could study the disease progression. Many were veterans. The study did not end until 1972. 600 people were enrolled. 28 died of syphilis. 100 died of related complications. Let us talk about prisoners of war, because the declassified records tell a very different story than the one most people learned. On all sides, the treatment of captured soldiers violated international law in ways that were systematically concealed for decades. The official histories were carefully sanitized. Soviet prisoners in German custody died at a rate unprecedented in modern warfare. According to German military records declassified in the 1990s, approximately 3.3 million Soviet POWs died in German captivity. That is a 57% mortality rate. Most died of starvation, exposure, and disease. Many were simply shot. The Germans initially captured 5.7 million Soviet soldiers. By May 1944, only roughly 900,000 remained alive in captivity. The others were dead or had been released to forced labor. This was not battlefield casualties. This was deliberate policy. The Hunger Plan explicitly called for reducing Slavic populations through starvation. Japanese treatment of Allied prisoners was documented in the Tokyo war crimes trials. Of the approximately 140,000 Western prisoners held by Japan, more than 36,000 died in captivity. The death rate was 27%. For those on the Burma Railway alone, it approached 33%. The Bataan Death March claimed between 5,000 and 18,000 lives, depending on which records you consult. American and Filipino prisoners were forced to walk 65 miles with almost no food or water. Those who fell were bayoneted, shot, or beheaded. The survivors were then placed in camps where the dying continued. But here is a fact that the Allied records kept quiet for decades. German submarine crews who surrendered often fared poorly as well. A 2006 release of British naval documents revealed instances where U-boat survivors were machine-gunned in the water rather than rescued. The official position was that this never happened. The London Cage was a British interrogation centre that operated from 1940 to 1948. According to documents released in 2005, prisoners there were beaten, deprived of sleep, and subjected to mock executions. Colonel Alexander Scotland, who ran the facility, wrote a memoir that the War Office suppressed for decades. American treatment of German prisoners was generally better documented and more humane. But the exceptions tell their own story. The Rhein-Wiesenlager, or Rhine Meadow camps, held over 1 million German prisoners in 1945. Declassified medical records suggest mortality rates far higher than officially acknowledged. The exact numbers remain disputed. Soviet treatment of German prisoners was catastrophic. Of roughly 3 million German POWs taken by the Soviets, at least 350,000 died. Some estimates put the figure above 1 million. The survivors were not fully repatriated until 1956, 11 years after the war ended. Some camps held prisoners until 1950. Japanese prisoners in Soviet custody fared even worse. Approximately 600,000 Japanese soldiers were captured in Manchuria in 1945. They were sent to labor camps across Siberia. At least 60,000 died from cold, disease, and starvation. Some were not repatriated until 1956. The Soviet Union denied holding them for years. Now we need to discuss intelligence operations, because the declassified files reveal a shadow war that makes the public history look almost naive. The espionage, the double agents, the deliberate sacrifices of entire operations, and sometimes entire populations for strategic advantage. None of it made the newspapers at the time. Ultra-intelligence, derived from breaking German Enigma codes, was kept secret until 1974. For nearly 30 years after the war, one of the greatest intelligence achievements in history was completely hidden from the public. Veterans who had worked at Bletchley Park took their secrets to the grave without ever being able to explain their service. The most disturbing revelation from the Ultrafiles is this. British intelligence knew in advance about the German bombing of Coventry on November 14, 1940. They chose not to evacuate the city because doing so might reveal they had broken Enigma. 568 people died. Churchill was briefed beforehand. This was not the only time intelligence was protected at the cost of lives. Declassified files show that the British allowed an entire spy network in the Netherlands to continue operating even after they knew the Germans had captured it. The agents kept being sent. The Germans kept executing them. 54 Dutch agents died in what became known as the England Spiel. The double-cross system turned almost every German spy in Britain into a double agent. The 20th Committee ran these agents throughout the war, feeding false information to Berlin. What the declassified files reveal is the cold calculus involved. Some operations required sacrificing assets, including human beings, to maintain cover stories. Soviet penetration of Western intelligence was far deeper than acknowledged for decades. The Cambridge Five spies passed atomic secrets, military plans, and intelligence assessments to Moscow throughout the war. And after Kim Philby, one of the five, rose to become head of anti-Soviet operations for British intelligence while working for the KGB, the secret weapons programs of World War II were shrouded in classification that lasted decades. Both sides developed technologies they hoped would win the war. Both sides committed atrocities in the process, and both sides recruited each other's scientists afterward. Regardless of what those scientists had done, the V-Fay rocket killed approximately 9,000 people when it fell on London and Antwerp. But more people died building the rockets than died from being hit by them. Approximately 20,000 slave laborers died in the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp, constructing V-Fays. They worked underground in tunnels. The conditions were designed to kill. Wernher von Braun, the lead V-Fay designer, regularly visited Mittelbau-Dora. According to testimony at the Nuremberg trials, he personally witnessed hangings of prisoners who had attempted sabotage. After the war, he was brought to the United States under Operation Paperclip. He became director of NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center and designed the Saturn V. Operation Paperclip brought over 1,600 German scientists to the United States between 1945 and 1959. Their Nazi Party memberships were scrubbed from official records. Their war crimes were overlooked. Arthur Rudolph, who managed Waffe production at Mittelbau-Dora, directed Saturn V production for NASA and received the Distinguished Service Medal. The Manhattan Project has been extensively documented, but declassified files continue to reveal new details. Between 1944 and 1974, the United States conducted thousands of radiation experiments on American citizens without their knowledge or consent. Prisoners, hospital patients, pregnant women, and even children were exposed to radioactive materials. After Hiroshima and Nagasaki, American scientists arrived to study the effects of radiation on survivors. They collected data but were ordered not to provide medical treatment. The Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission documented injuries for decades while offering no therapy. The priority was research, not relief. This was classified policy. The debate over whether to drop the atomic bombs continues, but declassified documents reveal that by August 1945, many senior military leaders considered Japan already defeated. Admiral William Leahy, Chief of Staff to the President, wrote that using the bomb was not necessary. General Eisenhower expressed similar views. The decision was made anyway. The target selection for the atomic bombs was carefully deliberate. Declassified meeting notes show that Kyoto was originally the primary target, but was removed from the list because Secretary of War Stimson had visited the city and appreciated its cultural significance. Hiroshima was chosen partly because it had not been heavily bombed and would show the weapon's effects clearly. The atomic bombs killed between 130,000 and 226,000 people. But the firebombing of Tokyo on March 9th and 10th, 1945, killed approximately 100,000 people in a single night. General Curtis LeMay later admitted that if America had lost the war, he would have been tried as a war criminal. The combined Allied bombing campaigns killed approximately 400,000 German civilians and between 330,000 and 500,000 Japanese civilians. Dresden, Hamburg, Berlin, Tokyo, Osaka. The policy was deliberate targeting of population centers. The stated goal was breaking enemy morale. The actual effect on morale remains disputed. Declassified British documents show that the bombing strategy was more brutal than publicly acknowledged. Area bombing was official policy from 1942. The goal was not precision strikes on military targets, but the systematic destruction of German cities. Air Marshal Arthur Harris called it dehousing the German working class. Chemical weapons were stockpiled by all major powers during World War II. According to declassified records, the United States produced 146,000 tons of chemical agents. Britain produced 40,000 tons. Germany produced 70,000 tons. None were used on the battlefield, but the threat of retaliation was constant. The Bari disaster of December 1943 was classified for decades. German aircraft bombed an Italian harbor where American ships were unloading. One ship, the John Harvey, carried a secret cargo of 2,000 mustard gas bombs. The explosion killed approximately 1,000 people, many from chemical exposure. The incident was covered up until 1967. The Battle of the Atlantic claimed approximately 36,000 Allied sailors. But declassified German records reveal the submarine crews suffered even higher proportional losses. Of the 40,000 men who served in U-boats, 30,000 died. That is a 75% casualty rate. The average life expectancy for a U-boat crew member was 6 months. War crimes on the Eastern Front were documented in staggering detail by the perpetrators themselves. The Einsatzgruppen mobile killing units sent regular reports to Berlin recording their massacres. At Baby Yar in September 1941, they murdered 33,771 Jews in 2 days. They noted the exact figure in their own paperwork. The methodical nature of the killing is what makes the documents so chilling. Reports were typed, filed, and archived. Chain of command was maintained. Promotions were given based on performance. The bureaucracy of genocide functioned like any other bureaucracy. Carbon copies were made. Receipts were kept for ammunition expenditure. The Holocaust was not just about concentration camps. According to documents compiled by German researchers, approximately 2 million people were shot by Einsatzgruppen and other units in the occupied Soviet Union. This was the Holocaust by bullets. Many execution sites are still being discovered. Many victims remain unidentified. Allied war crimes were far less frequently prosecuted. The massacre at Biscari in Sicily, where American troops murdered 73 Italian and German prisoners in 1943, resulted in 2 convictions. Both men were later freed. General Patton, whose orders arguably contributed to the killings, was never charged. Declassified files from 2013 revealed systematic sexual violence by American soldiers during the liberation of France. Historian Mary Louise Roberts documented thousands of cases. The U.S. Army executed 29 soldiers for rape in the European theater, but court-martial records suggest the actual incidence was far higher than officially acknowledged. The forced repatriation of Soviet citizens after the war is one of the least discussed Allied decisions. Under Operation Keelhaul, approximately 2 million people were returned to the Soviet Union against their will. Stalin had declared that surrender was treason. Many returnees were executed or sent to labor camps. Western leaders knew this would happen. The Cossacks at Lienz were among the most tragic victims. On June 1, 1945, British soldiers turned over approximately 40,000 Cossacks and their families to Soviet forces. The transfer involved beatings and at least one mass suicide. Most of those handed over disappeared into the Gulag system. The British records were classified for decades. When Allied forces liberated the concentration camps, what they found was so horrifying that footage was restricted for decades. General Eisenhower ordered extensive documentation because he feared no one would believe it happened. He was right to worry. Denial began almost immediately and continues today, despite overwhelming evidence. The division of Europe after World War II created its own ongoing tragedy. Declassified files reveal that both sides knew Soviet occupation would mean repression, but accepted it as the price of victory. The Yalta and Potsdam agreements effectively consigned millions of people to decades of authoritarian rule. The Cold War began before World War II ended. Many records were destroyed rather than declassified. German military intelligence, the Abwehr, burned most of its files in 1945. The Soviet NKVD destroyed documentation of its own atrocities, including the Katyn massacre of 22,000 Polish officers. Both sides had reasons to hide what they had done. The Katyn massacre was blamed on the Nazis for 50 years. Soviet and later Russian authorities denied responsibility until 1990, when Gorbachev finally acknowledged that the NKVD had executed the Polish prisoners in April 1940. The killings were authorized at the highest levels. Stalin signed the death warrant. This was concealed for half a century. Declassified American and British intelligence files show that both governments knew the truth about Katyn during the war, but suppressed it because the Soviet Union was an ally. They participated in the cover-up. Churchill received a detailed report concluding Soviet guilt in 1943. He buried it. The alliance was more important than the truth. Economic warfare and looting generated fortunes that are still being traced. Nazi Germany systematically plundered occupied territories. Gold from central banks, art from museums, dental fillings from concentration camp victims. Much of it passed through Switzerland, whose neutrality proved very profitable. The full accounting was impossible for decades. The Monuments men recovered millions of artworks, but many remain missing. Declassified records estimate that the Nazis looted approximately 20% of all European art. The Amber Room stripped from a Russian palace has never been found. Individual masterpieces continue to surface in bank vaults and private collections. Claims are still being litigated. Corporate complicity with Nazi Germany extended further than many companies have admitted. IBM supplied the punch card systems used to organize the Holocaust. Ford subsidiaries manufactured military vehicles for the Wehrmacht. Standard Oil subsidiaries provided fuel additives. Many of these relationships were documented in declassified files, but rarely discussed publicly. At least 750,000 concentration camp prisoners were rented out to German corporations as slave labor. Companies like IG Farben, Krupp, Siemens, and BMW used this workforce. After the war, some executives were prosecuted. Most were released early. The companies continued operating. Some exist today. The financial records of slave labor are particularly disturbing. Companies paid the SS approximately 6 Reichsmarks per Dalton Y for skilled workers, 4 for unskilled. The prisoners received nothing. When they died from exhaustion or were killed, the companies simply requested replacements. It was an entirely rational business arrangement documented in ledgers that still exist. IG Farben deserves special attention. The chemical conglomerate manufactured Zyklon B, the gas used in the death chambers. It operated a factory at Auschwitz. At least 30,000 slave laborers died there. After the war, IG Farben was split into Bayer, BAS, and Hoechst. All three became successful multinational corporations. Neutral countries played complex roles. Declassified files reveal that Sweden sold iron ore to Germany throughout the war. Spain provided bases and supplies to German submarines. Turkey sold chrome essential for armor production. Portugal sold tungsten. Argentina became a refuge for fleeing Nazis. Neutrality was often profitable and sometimes deliberately permeable. The Vatican's wartime role remains controversial. Pope Pius XII never publicly condemned the Holocaust during the war. Declassified documents from 2020 reveal that the Vatican received detailed reports about mass killings as early as 1942. The reasons for the silence are still debated. Some documents remain sealed. The ratlines that helped Nazi war criminals escape to South America were partly organized through Vatican channels. Adolf Eichmann, Josef Mengele, Klaus Barbie, and thousands of others fled using this network. Declassified files show American and British intelligence agencies later employed some of these fugitives during the Cold War. Josef Mengele, the doctor who conducted experiments on twins at Auschwitz, lived in South America for 34 years after the war. He was never captured. He drowned while swimming in Brazil in 1979. Israeli intelligence came close to capturing him multiple times, but never succeeded. His remains were not identified until 1985. War crimes prosecutions continue today. The last Nazi trials have involved guards who were teenagers during the war and are now in their 90s. Bruno Day was convicted in 2020 at age 93 for complicity in 5,232 murders at Stutthof concentration camp. He was sentenced to 2 years suspended. The principle established at Nuremberg that following orders is not a defense has echoed through every war crimes trial since. Yet the declassified record shows how selectively that principle was applied. Some war criminals were prosecuted, others were recruited. The deciding factor was often whether their skills were useful to the new Cold War order. The resistance movements in occupied Europe were far more significant than often acknowledged. In Yugoslavia, partisans tied down dozens of German divisions. In the Soviet Union, guerrilla fighters disrupted supply lines continuously. In France, the Maquis conducted thousands of sabotage operations, but the cost was staggering. German reprisal policy was systematic and brutal. For every German soldier killed by partisans, 50 to 100 civilians would be executed. Entire villages were destroyed. Lidis in Czechoslovakia was razed completely in June 1942. All men over 15 were shot. Women were sent to concentration camps. Children were gassed. The village was erased. Oradour-sur-Glane in France was destroyed on June 10, 1944. 4 days after D-Day, SS troops massacred 642 people, including women and children locked in the church and burned alive. The ruins were preserved exactly as they were left. 21 soldiers were eventually convicted. Most served minimal sentences. The D-Day landings themselves generated classified information for decades. Declassified records reveal that Allied intelligence knew German defenses were stronger than publicly admitted. Casualty estimates before the invasion were much higher than the actual toll. Eisenhower wrote a letter taking full responsibility for failure. He never had to send it, but he was prepared. The decision to launch on June 6 was based on a brief weather window group. Captain James Stagg convinced Eisenhower to proceed despite uncertain forecasts. German meteorologists predicted the bad weather would continue and relaxed their defenses. Rommel went home to Germany for his wife's birthday. That weather prediction helped decide the war. At Omaha Beach, approximately 2,000 Americans died on June 6, 1944 alone. The official history praised courage under fire. Declassified after-action reports tell a more complex story of confusion, equipment failures, units landing in wrong sectors, and soldiers pinned down for hours unable to move or fire back. The airborne operations on D-Day were far more chaotic than portrayed. Paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were scattered across Normandy. Many drowned in flooded fields. Others landed miles from their objectives. The dispersion actually confused the Germans, but it was not intentional. It resulted from poor visibility and anti-aircraft fire. The liberation of France came at tremendous cost to French civilians. Declassified documents estimate that Allied bombing and ground operations killed approximately 70,000 French people between June and August 1944. Cassel was 80% destroyed. Rouen-le Havre, Saint-Lô, and countless smaller towns were devastated by forces supposedly liberating them. Operation Market Garden. The airborne assault on Dutch bridges in September 1944 failed to capture its final objective at Arnhem. The official history blamed intelligence failures. Declassified Dutch records suggest that resistance fighters warned the Allies about German tank units in the area. The warnings were ignored. The Battle of the Bulge was Germany's last major offensive. Declassified American records reveal that intelligence warnings about the attack were ignored or dismissed. The offensive achieved complete surprise. Over 19,000 Americans died in 6 weeks of fighting. The casualty figures were initially suppressed because they were deemed too damaging to morale. At Malmedy in Belgium on December 17, 1944, SS troops murdered approximately 84 American prisoners of war. When word of the massacre reached American lines, it affected treatment of German prisoners. Declassified reports suggest surrender became more difficult for Germans in that sector. Revenge killings likely occurred, but were rarely documented. The Soviet advance into Germany involved massive civilian casualties. Declassified Soviet records acknowledged that discipline broke down during the final offensive. Estimates suggest that 2 million German women were raped by Soviet soldiers in 1945. The numbers are disputed. Many victims never reported what happened. The taboo lasted decades. Between 12 and 14 million Germans fled or were expelled from Eastern Europe after the war. Declassified records suggest that between 500,000 and 2 million died during these expulsions. Entire populations were removed from territories Germany had occupied or claimed for centuries. It was ethnic cleansing endorsed by the Allied powers. The internment of Japanese Americans was declared a military necessity. Approximately 120,000 people, most of them American citizens, were imprisoned without trial. Declassified documents from the 1980s revealed that government lawyers had knowingly suppressed evidence that there was no military justification. The policy was based on racism, not security. In 1988, President Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act, acknowledging that internment was wrong. Survivors received $20,000 each. The documents proving the government knew internment was unjustified had been classified for over 40 years. Similar internment of German and Italian Americans received far less attention. The Pacific War generated its own suppressed histories. Declassified records reveal that American forces sometimes killed Japanese soldiers attempting to surrender. The reasons were complex, including language barriers, fears of traps, and cultural attitudes. Official policy required accepting surrender. Actual practice often differed. The fighting on islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa was characterized by brutality that was downplayed in official accounts. Declassified Marine Corps records document instances of trophy taking, including skulls and other body parts. Life magazine published a photograph of a skull sent home as a gift in 1944. This was not unusual. The decision to use atomic weapons generated classified debates that only emerged decades later. The Frank Report, prepared by Manhattan Project scientists, warned against using the bomb on a city without prior demonstration. It was classified and ignored. Secretary of War Stimson overruled suggestions to warn Japan specifically about the atomic threat. Japan's surrender was not as straightforward as often portrayed. Declassified documents reveal that even after Nagasaki, hardliners in the Japanese military wanted to continue fighting. A coup attempt on August 14, 1945, sought to prevent the surrender broadcast. Emperor Hirohito's recorded message was nearly seized by officers refusing to accept defeat. The occupation of Japan involved suppression of information about Japanese war crimes. Declassified records show that Emperor Hirohito was shielded from prosecution as a deliberate policy decision. General MacArthur believed keeping the emperor was essential for governing Japan. The price was limiting the scope of war crimes trials. The comfort women system was barely mentioned at the Tokyo trials. Approximately 200,000 women from Korea, China, the Philippines, and other occupied territories were forced into sexual slavery by the Japanese military. The full documentation was not released until the 1990s. Japan has issued multiple apologies, but disputes over acknowledgement continue today. Many documents remain classified today. The British government continues to seal certain World War II files. American agencies maintain classified material from the period. Russian archives have been partially opened and then restricted again. The full story is still emerging, fact by fact, file by file, revelation by revelation. What do we do with this knowledge? The declassified records reveal that every nation committed acts it later wanted hidden. Every government made decisions that cost innocent lives. Every side in the war has reasons to keep certain facts buried. The simple narratives we learned in school are not lies exactly. They are incomplete truths. The historians who spend their careers in these archives emerge with complicated views. The good versus evil narrative of World War II is not wrong. The Allies were fighting genuine evil. The Nazi regime and Imperial Japan committed atrocities that demanded resistance. But the good side also did terrible things. That complexity matters. We tell simplified stories because complicated ones are harder to teach. We classify documents because the truth might undermine current alliances or embarrass living people or their descendants. We seal archives because some knowledge seems too dangerous or too damaging to release. But eventually, the files open. Eventually, the truth emerges. Every few years, another batch of records becomes available. Another nation admits what it denied. Another survivor feels safe enough to finally tell their story. The history of World War II is not finished. It is still being written, still being revealed, still being understood. What we know now is more than we knew 50 years ago. If you have made it this far, you now know 100 facts from the declassified record of World War II. Not theories, not speculation. Documented realities that governments kept hidden for decades. The darkness in these files is real, but so is the light that eventually reached them. The generation that fought World War II is nearly gone. The youngest veterans are approaching 100 years old. Soon, no one alive will remember what it was actually like. All we will have are the records, the declassified files, the documented facts, the uncomfortable truths that took decades to emerge. These facts are not meant to diminish anyone's sacrifice. Millions of people fought and died to stop genuine evil. That remains true. But they deserve a full accounting. They deserve the truth about what was done in their name, what was hidden from them, what their sacrifices actually cost, and what they actually achieved. Perhaps the most important lesson from the declassified record is this: governments lie, all governments, in all wars. For what they believe are good reasons, the lies protect intelligence sources, they maintain alliances, they prevent panic, they preserve morale. But they also hide atrocities, cover up failures. The documents exist because someone wrote them down. They survive because someone saved them. They eventually emerge because someone fights to declassify them. The process is slow. It takes decades, but it works. The truth, or at least more of it, eventually comes out. History corrects itself. one open file at a time. If you want to know more, the records are available. The National Archives in multiple countries have digitized millions of pages. Universities maintain specialized collections. Freedom of information requests continue to pry open sealed files. The work of historians, journalists, and dedicated researchers continues. The declassified record grows every year. If you are drifting off now, let these facts settle into memory. They are not pleasant, but they are real. They remind us that the past is more complicated than we often admit. They remind us that official histories are always incomplete. They remind us that truth, however dark, is better than comfortable lies. The files will still be here tomorrow. The declassified record will keep growing. More truths will emerge. More uncomfortable facts will come to light. The full story of World War II is still being written, and somewhere in an archive, a document you have never heard of is waiting to be opened. Sleep well. The secrets have waited this long. They can wait until morning, and when you wake, perhaps you will look at history a little differently. Perhaps you will remember that the official story is never the complete story. Perhaps you will wonder what else remains classified, waiting in the darkness for someone to finally turn on the light.